Welcome to this Conveyancing Matters chat, which is our monthly conveyancing news update, and we're looking at things that have happened in January 2022. Welcome to Conveyancing Matters with Lorraine and Stu. Join us for a chat about all things property. So, Stu, what's caught your eyes in conveyancing news this month?
Well, there's a few things, aren't there? So I think first of all, maybe the interesting news with the fines recently incurred by HSBC for AML failings.
Yeah, we've had HSBC and NatWest fined many millions for anti-money laundering failings. And I know this is a subject we talk about a lot, Stu, but interestingly, actually, a lovely subscriber said recently to me in a private message, she found one of the AML chats that we did really, really interesting. So do remember to subscribe if you haven't, because we talk about stuff that's relevant to conveyancers all the time. But AML is the big one. And what really worries me about anti-money laundering, Stu, is that it becomes a bit like the wallpaper, doesn't it? In that it's always there and people stop thinking about it. So I know we talked about this in a different chat, but what perhaps are some of the key messages that you would have for firms and conveyancers in relation to anti-money laundering?
I think the key message is how important it is. I think we sort of get mixed messages when we talk about money laundering and how it affects the world in general. But of course we are, and we can't understate how much, we are a target for criminals, and obviously the main part of that would be money laundering and AML. So those checks that we do, they're not a process, they're not just a tick box exercise. It's actually looking at the results and actually investigating those bank statements. I think too many times here, I've seen people that are collecting the right information, but it's not just a case of collecting it. You've got to actually go through those bank statements and you're sort of investigating that client's money. And most importantly, it's not just bank statements, it's the origin of the money, where's it come from, and what else have you got to show? So that if somebody does knock on the door and say, well, didn't you think that was a problem? You can say, well, not really, because X, Y, Z, look what I'm holding.
Well, and one of the messages in relation to all the decisions we reach these days, Stu, of course, is I always call it show you working out. You've got to demonstrate why you came to the decision that you came to. But I mean, one of the things I find startling about the stories about the banks is that one of them, as I say, and they were fined multi-million pounds, is that somebody turned up with a bin bag of cash, which gives you a bit of an image. But it's not just the banks. And one of the country's most well-known firms, Michon de Reya, has recently been fined over £230,000 for AML failings. And this information is out there. And I just thought maybe before we move on to a different topic, Stu, I would literally read out some of the points that the SRA itself made in relation to the fine meted out to Michon de Reya, because some of the facts are that whilst working for two individual clients and corporate vehicles connected with those same individuals, some of the following things happened. So the firm believed that customer due diligence was obtained in relation to the two individual clients, but the firm didn't retain a hard copy of the file. The files appear to have been misplaced, and no electronic copy of the records were retained. Some documents, but not a full set of customer due diligence documents, were obtained in relation to one of the corporate vehicles, so incomplete due diligence. Enhanced customer due diligence was not adequately applied when the files were identified as being at risk of high risk of money laundering. Certain payments were made out of the firm's client account, which didn't relate to an underlying legal transaction, which, as we know, is really then allowing client account to be used as a banking facility. And the partner in charge, former partner, I should say, who was responsible for the relationship with the clients, hadn't received mandatory training as required by the anti-money laundering regs, and the firm has stated, and the SRA accepted, that such training would usually be provided, but in addition, there was no contingency plan at the firm for AML training to be implemented if there was a personnel absence. So I don't really want to comment beyond those, because I think they are all key learning points in themselves, Stu, and they are just direct quotes from the SRA. So forgive me for sort of reading it out and being a bit dull, but that's one of the most well-known firms in the country.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be taken from that. Different levels, aren't there? I think from a managerial sort of stance, obviously periodically giving that training and actually keeping records of all that training is obviously a must, not only to demonstrate that people have had that training, but also to protect yourself, i.e. you can prove that that relevant training was given. And then from even an employee's point of view, I think we get lost in the details somewhat, but the importance of this can't be understated. And it's not just the firm that might have a problem if there is a problem. And you were found to be at the heart of it. Aiding and abetting money laundering is obviously a criminal offence that could lead to imprisonment. So
that's certainly one of your recurring themes when we talk about this stuff, Stu, is the personal responsibility that the fee is taking on here. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think if you haven't had that training, you need to get it, and you need to be sort of nagging, wherever you are at whatever firm for that training, because it is that important. Possibly in terms of training as a generalisation, maybe the most important, possibly.
I would argue in many cases, to be honest, because it is the training that the regulators and everybody are going to be looking for, really. But well, moving on, Stu. We've got the land registry fees going up for the first time since 2009 on the 31st of January 2022. So how have you found that sort of tricky to get the additional required fees from clients? How have you handled that?
Well, not yet, but I'm certain it will be. I think we discussed before that it's a bit of a pain, maybe in terms of its timing. I don't think anybody would begrudge the land registry actually raising their fees, but to announce it when they did, giving us a very short window of time to actually deal with it was more the issue. But of course, in terms of what we do on a practical front, it's just getting as many applications into the land registry, and obviously making sure that not only are they put in, if we do get requisitions, if anything is cancelled, it does need to be dealt with by the end of January. Otherwise, if we do resubmit something in February, we're going to incorporate the higher fee, aren't we?
Yeah, that's a really important point, Stu, and the land reg. And to be fair to the land reg, they have sort of trailed this a lot now around social media. But I do agree that right off the back of the end of the stamp duty land tax no holiday in the run up to the Christmas rush, that timing wasn't ideal. I suspect that there are just going to be a whole shed load of conveyancing firms out there who've got sort of outstanding amounts of land registry fees on office account. That's how I think this is going to go. But what the land registry... Sorry, go on, Stu.
Yeah, I think so. I think one key point as well is, although I appreciate how difficult this would be, but I think, if there are any barriers that prevent you making the application to the land registry, it's advising the client what that barrier is and the implications that, you're going to have to pay an extra 20 quid or whatever the case may be because of it. So whether that's, waiting for a certificate from a management company, whatever the circumstances may well be, it's trying to keep that communication channel with the client open, so that they're aware that they may have to add more money.
Yeah, I think the land reg need to brace themselves for an absolute deluge of applications, to be quite frank. But also, actually, Stu, and I'll sort of conclude with the point I was going to make in a minute, but of course another really important point that firms need to realise, and I know we're only perhaps talking sort of 15, 20 quid here and there, but on a lot of files that adds up very quickly, and I think there will be a lot of money outstanding on office, because of course practitioners do need to remember that waiting for the money from the client isn't a reason to not submit the land registry application if you've got a lender, because of course one of the lender's requirements, as you and I know, is that the firm has both the stamp duty land tax and the land registry fees in client account by the time the mortgage advance is released on completion. And if the firm doesn't have land registry and stamp duty land tax fees, the firm is expected to put its hand in its own pocket. So firms will be paying this out of office. But just absolutely to reiterate the point that you made, because I think this is a really important little nuanced point for firms, that the new fees, the increased fees, are payable when an application is submitted on or after 31st January, and when an application is cancelled or rejected and resubmitted on or after 31st January. So effectively, the new fees come into force on the 31st. But as you've quite rightly said, Stu, if an application is cancelled for whatever reason and you resubmit it, even if you got it in before the 31st January deadline, you're going to be stumping up the extra fee if you're resubmitting. So, so that's an important point. Good. Okay, Stu. Well, Michael Gove mentioned, came up with some warm words about cladding. So I'm not sure that it takes us really very much further forward, does it? I mean, he said...
yeah, I mean, I'm not sure there's anything in it which is really going to help us as such, but I think what it does go to show is at least it's on somebody's radar of a senior level. So, you know, with everything that's going on at the moment, I'm sure it's something that we're not going to find conclusion on particularly imminently, but at least somebody has come out and actually made a statement, which means at least somebody's looking at it. That's the key.
Yeah, exactly. As I say, I think it needed to be up, you know, a minister's on the top of at least one minister's to-do list. So Gove mentioned that leaseholders won't be expected to take out loans to pay for sort of cladding remediation works, and has come out with comments that developers are going to be expected to put their hands in their pockets and pay, albeit some of them are pushing back on that already. But I say this quite a lot when I'm training, Stu. Does that make any difference to the coalface conveyancer today? And I think the answer is probably no. I think it's any positive news for people trapped in flats is good news, don't get me wrong. But I don't think in terms of what impact does it have on, you know, your colleagues and your files today. I think it's pretty limited. If you know, and the lenders have got to play. The lenders and surveyors have got to play. Doesn't matter what the government tells them about, you know, you don't need an EWS1 certificate for this, but if they're not prepared to take the risk, and why would they? Then practically on the ground, not much is going to change.
No, definitely.
I do think it's worth just briefly mentioning. I don't know whether it's brand new or updated, but it's probably just worth making mentioning for colleagues watching that the Conveyancing Association has actually issued some guidance on cladding. So if anybody, for practitioners particularly, as to what EWS1 certificates are and when to use them and so on. I've not looked at it in any detail, I must say, but the guidance is out there. So if any conveyancers are sort of flailing a bit, then there's some guidance on the Conveyancing Association's website.
I think one of the initial problems with cladding was actually the fact there was such a lack of guidance, wasn't there? It kind of like crept up on us, didn't it? Crept up us and sort of stuck us around the face. And there was a lack of guidance, I think, from all directions. So at least now we're sort of conforming, and there's more information out there that we can use practically. Like you say, rather than talking about it and everything else at different levels, at least there's stuff out there now that you know, day-to-day work in looking at files you can refer to.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Stu, absolutely. And maybe sort of moving on then, something else that I think is positive, but isn't necessarily going to help us every day yet. We've had a few developers now on the age-old cliche of ground rents. We've had a few developers come out and sort of confirm that, frankly, in the light of a Competition and Markets Authority review, a few developers have come out and said, yes, we're going to ban doubling ground rents. Countryside Properties said it a while ago, Persimmon Aviva. We've had another one come out recently, Stu.
Taylor Wimpey, is it?
Yeah.
That have come out and said that they're no longer going to enforce those. Again, it's about time, isn't it? I don't think these announcements are going to change everything that we're doing practically overnight, are they? We're still going to come across plenty of them. But I think that the key point here is recognising when that ground rent does double and what it can exceed during its, you know, during the lease term, and making sure that we are reporting these issues straight away to the bank and looking at it from that point of view. I know from our indemnity insurers, it's a massive risk part of the renewal, looking at what steps we take to identify these and what we do about it. So it's really, really important that we're paying particular attention to these leases and the amount of ground rent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for anybody that's got a lease that involves any of these developers, and Taylor Wimpey put out a press release only in December 2021, and they have come up with sort of two different scenarios where Taylor Wimpey is the freeholder, they will do X, Y, and Z, and where Taylor Wimpey isn't the freeholder, they'll still try and do this, and this. And I think again the sort of implication for us at the coalface, and you're absolutely right, Stu, is A, report it to your buyer, B, report it to your lender. I mean, what I've been trying to sort of persuade people to do when I've been talking on courses is don't leave it weeks before you look at the lease. As soon as you get a lease in, look for all these obvious issues, ground rent, residue, etc., and report on it immediately, because the transaction might be falling out of bed. But I think it's really important to remember that it's absolutely good that the likes of Taylor Wimpey, Persimmon, etc., are making these noises. But of course, these leases are still going to need to, be amended with a deed of variation. There's still legal work to do. The terms of these leases aren't just going to sort of magically change. And I think people need to understand the impact of that on transactions and so on, don't they, Stu?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, I hate to even think it's probably an unquantifiable amount of leases out there that do have these within. So, whether they stop them, full stop, whatever the case may be, we're still day to day practically going to be coming across these every day.
Yeah.
So it's really, really important that we're paying attention. I think ground rent potentially was the lesser of the problems when you were looking for a lease previously and historically, wasn't it? It was something that it was X amount and we report it was X amount to the client and didn't think anything more of it. But now, of course, it's a totally different entity, and it's grown to be of equal importance, if not one of the key things that you would now look at. Like you say, when you get that lease, we always do exactly that, as you've just advocated. As soon as we get that lease, it's kind of, I suppose, a mini risk assessment of that lease. Flicking through those initial points. How much term is left? Does the ground rent double? Blah 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 blah. To find out. I think historically we always worried about leases being defective, didn't we? That was the terms that we used to use, defective leases. But now I think, a key point, a key overhaul of it, just to look at those initial problems, to see moving forward, is it going to be something that's risky to deal with?
Yeah, I think, and as a client of mine once said, these are potentially showstoppers. These are things that potentially mean the transaction won't go ahead if the lender takes its teddy and won't play. So I also wonder, and I appreciate it's not always easy to do, but whether, the buyer needs to understand that, they've got a choice. You either report this to the lender as soon as you know who the lender is, of course, early on, and say to the buyer, well, do you want us to do any more work until we get the yes from the lender? Or do you want us to hold fire? But you have to accept that if you don't want us to do any more work because you don't want to incur abortive fees, that's going to build in more delay to what's already likely to be quite a lengthy transaction. But I think firms need to make that clear to their buyers, really. And that age-old thing, we advise, the client instructs.
Yeah, definitely. There's plenty of stuff on the internet as well that you can refer a client to.
Yeah.
If they wanted to go over and do their sort of own investigation. So I think merely it's just drawing their attention to it.
Yeah. And speaking of Tinternet, actually, probably worth now conveyancers actually doing a quick sort of, Google of all the main developers when you get them in a newer lease, and seeing if that developer, going to that developer's website and seeing if that developer has made an announcement about its attitude to ground rents and so on, because that might help a transaction move forward. And a government press release actually dated the 22nd of December 2021 has pointed out that the Competition and Markets Authority is continuing to investigate two investment groups, Brigante Properties and Abacus Land and Adriatic Land, basically asking them what they intend to do about doubling ground rents. And the CMA's investigation into Barratt Developments is also continuing. Now, there's no suggestion that any of those organisations have done anything wrong, but again, I think, you know, Adriatic is certainly a pretty frequent name that crops up, Barratt similarly, and we need to be at the forefront of being able to advise our clients, well, this is where we are now. You know, do you want to go ahead with the situation as it is now, or do you want to potentially wait? And I think that's an issue that we also need to be advising our clients about. But I think we should be looking and going to a developer's website to see if they've got a position on these things, or a freeholder's website.
I think on a slightly different tangent as well, I'm always critical of some of the guys that work for me in terms of, you know, they're forever looking at stuff, forever solving problems, looking at complex issues. But it's actually selling ourselves in terms of what we do, isn't it? So I think there's no harm actually pointing out to a client that you've done this initial précis and there could potentially be problems. Right. Obviously there's, you know, it's a way of managing expectations, maybe on a different level. If you're then talking about, for example, deed of variations, it gives you that avenue to row in those extra costs that you should quite rightly be charging if you have to do that extra work. So
yeah, exactly.
It fills a number of different purposes, doesn't it?
I think so. Well, are there any other sort of particular news things that has struck you in the last month or so, Stu? I mean, there's always a lot going on, always a lot in the legal press.
There's always loads in the world of conveyancing, isn't there? But I suppose we can't really leave another news topic or show without talking about COVID, can we? It's a weird one, isn't it? The start of the year, if we'd done this maybe early January, it might have been a completely different conversation when statistics were looking at showing us that, you know, everything was going wrong again. We're now entering a period where maybe we're looking to come out of the current pandemic. But, you know, we spoke about COVID a number of times before and COVID clauses. So I'm hopeful we may not need to bring this subject up again. What do you think?
I think we probably will be bringing the subject up again, Lovely, but I think we are consistent.
This is the last time.
Well, our consistent view will be, and remember, we're not giving advice, we're just sort of making our general comments, but you and I have never been a big fan of COVID clauses in residential conveyancing contracts, and I suspect that will remain our position. So I guess our thoughts for conveyancers out there, if you're presented with a COVID clause, find an alternative like a simultaneous, but do remember to advise your client accordingly. But I really hope we don't have to mention the C word against you, but I have a horrible feeling we might. Well, somehow
who knows what's going to happen. But I think that the should we say the moral of the story, or the moral of the point, whatever you want to call it, especially for those sort of younger guys and training, you know, guys that are training at the moment, just reinforces the importance of advising the client that when they commit to that exchange, this is not just a process, they're committing to that contract, they are binding themselves to something, i.e. completion that could be taking place in 2 weeks. And there's a whole host of things that could happen that may mean you could, in theory, breach that contract. And these are the implications of breaching it. It's being clear on the advice that we give. And of course, who would have thought 2-3 years ago when we gave that advice, we could have been adding in a worldwide pandemic that could pop up to prevent completion from happening. So, you know, there are, of course, a number of things that could happen in the interim period before we complete that could in theory prevent it. And we spoke before about, you know, lenders and pulling offers and all sorts of things, you know, maybe availability of removal companies or you know, even we've had it before where we delay completion because unfortunately people have lost loved ones, not necessarily to COVID, but that can all have an impact. There's just so many things that can happen, and it's, you know, underline the importance of what that client is about to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's probably as good a place as any, Stu, to leave our January Conveyancing Matters news update. And if anybody's watching perhaps for the first time and wants to get reminders of when these YouTube chats come out, then do remember to subscribe. It's free. I'm so stupid, Stu. I thought for ages that subscribing on YouTube meant you have to pay. Subscribe to me means pay.
No comment.
But hey, thanks very much. Yeah, no, I don't look up to that. But so do remember to subscribe if you're interested in anything Stu and I've got to say, and we'll say thank you very much for watching, and hope to see you again soon. So take care, Stu.
Take care, guys. See ya.
Bye.